What is your first thoughts when you think about the M4 Sherman? Do you think about its weak gun? Do you think about its poor armor? Perhaps you may have heard it was a death trap. Were those true? How did it gain such a horrible reputation? If it was so bad, why did the United States build so many? The M4 Sherman, the tip of the spears of the Allied forces, and arguably the best tank during the war. So, was the M4 really a death trap? Was its armor that thin? And was its gun that bad? September 1st, 1939, Europe plunges into chaos. Germany invades Poland, which causes France and the UK to declare war on Germany. In mid-1940s, France falls to Germany. Germany's effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg came to revelation to the Allied forces to have better armor to keep up with the Panzer III's and IVs employed in the German offensive. The United States ill-prepared only had around 400 tanks available, and they were mostly M2 light tanks. The United States desperately needed an update. Nothing smaller than 75mm will do. The United States did not have a fully functioning turret design to house a 75mm gun, and instead they came out with the M3 Lee as a stopgap solution and put the 75mm on the sponson system in the meantime. The M3 Lee did feature good armor for early war at 38mm, and a 75mm gun which could outrange the PaK-38s and 5cm Panzer IIIs, which were very common in northern Africa. The M3 did have some design flaws. A high silhouette at 2.7 meters, which made it easy to spot at a distance. A riveted hull, which was very easy to manufacture. However, when an enemy round failed to penetrate the armor, the kinetic energy of the round will be transferred to the rivets and they would quite literally pop off and hit the crew inside at high velocity, often with lethal consequences. And its last big weakness, his main gun was mounted on a sponson system, which prevented the tank from taking a hull down position, and to aim the 75mm gun, the whole tank had to traverse. But for the most part, it was well liked by its crew. In April 1941, a new prototype emerges, the T6. The T6 kept the same suspension as the M3, and moved the 75mm gun on a fully traversable turret, and had a fully cast hull. In February 1942, the T6 was standardized and named after General William Sherman, with its military designation changed to be M4 and M4A1 respectively. The M4 had a welded hull, whilst the M4A1 kept its cast hull from the prototype. The British also adopted the M4, but instead of keeping the 75mm gun, they replaced it with a 17-pounder and changed its name to the Firefly. In October 1942, the M4 first saw combat in the Second Battle of El Alamein. During the battle, the M4 outgunned, out-armored, and outclassed the German and Italian tanks. The German Panzer Corps at the time could not penetrate the M4's armor with their 37 and low-velocity 75mm. After its great success in northern Africa, the United States doubled down on the M4 Sherman. The M4 also saw combat in the Pacific, where the Sherman absolutely dominated the Japanese. The Japanese lacked well-armored and well-armed tanks, that is if they even encountered them. The biggest threat they faced in the Pacific was the 47mm anti-tank gun. The Sherman saw most action in the Western Front against the German, starting in Normandy. By 1944, German had increased the tank armor and the tank gun, such as the Panzer IVs and Stuck 3s, and they also designed and built new tanks, such as the Panzerkampfwagen 5, also known as the Panther, and the Panzerkampfwagen 6, the famous Tiger tank. However, since its debut in northern Africa, by D-Day a new Sherman was designed, the M4A2. The M4A2 received upgraded armor from 50 to 63mm, and on some tanks, the new 76 high velocity, which could knock out the cats of the Panzer Corps. By the end of the war, the Sherman was the second most produced tank of World War II, at 49,000 built, just short of the 57,000 of the Russian T-34s and variants. Now, let's go over the Sherman specifications. It came in 4 different varieties during the war. The M4, one of the first model, distinct by its welded front glacis at 55 degrees. The M4A1, the only cast model of the M4 variants, as the casting was very hard to accomplish at the time. The M4A2, which also featured a welded hull, which changed its angle to 47 degrees. And the M4A3, which had the same features as the A2, would improve its suspension and standardize the 76mm gun. At the start of the war, the M4 and M4A1 weighed 30 tons. In early 1944, the M4A2 weighed around 32 tons due to its added armor, and the M4A3 in the late 1944 was 38 tons. The Sherman had an average length of 5.8 to 6.2 meters, a width of 2.6 to 2.9 meters, and a height of 2.7 to 2.9 meters. The M4 was comprised of a crew of 5. The commander, the highest ranking man in the tank, he sat behind the gunner. His role was to command the tank through the intercoms and call out targets for the gunner. The commander had a sight mounted on the roof of the tank, and he could also manipulate the horizontal turret drive by roughly putting the gunner on target. The gunner, typically the next most senior man in the tank, he sat in front of the commander, operating the main gun and the coaxial 30 caliber Browning M1919. The loader, positioned to the left of the main gun, his only job was to feed the gun. The driver drove the tank. He had very poor visibility and heavily relied on the commander for directions. And the assistant driver, or bow gunner, this position had no control, located to the right front of the hull, only operated a 30 caliber Browning machine gun. His only way to aim was with tracer rounds looking through a periscope. Now let's look at the armor. The M4 had a thickness of 50mm at 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of 89mm. The M4A1 also had a thickness of 50mm. However, due to a castall, its angle varied from 37 to 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness between 63 to 88mm. The M4A2 and A3 had a thickness of 63mm angle at 47 degrees, making it an effective thickness of 92mm. The M4 and M4A1 had a side thickness of 38mm and the top thickness of 12mm. The M4A2 and A3 had a side armor of 38mm and a top thickness of 19mm. The M4 and M4A1 turret armor had 50mm and the A2 and A3 63mm. For its main armament used during the war, the most widely used was the 75mm. Later in the war, the 76 high velocity became more readily available, and the last one is the British 17-pounder, famously known as the Firefly. The 17-pounder had similar velocity and penetration values as the American 76 high velocity. The American 76 could penetrate 130mm at 500 meters, whilst the 17-pounder could penetrate 150mm at 500 meters. The 17-pounder was a more effective round. For secondary armament, it came with one M2 HB 50 caliber and two 30 caliber M1919 Brownings. The 50 caliber was mounted on top of the tank, and it was intended for use for anti-aircraft roles. Sometimes the crew would switch it out for a 30 caliber. The 2 caliber machine guns, one was a coaxial located beside the main gun, used by the gunner, and the other on the front right side of the tank, used by the bow gunner. The M4 gained a reputation of a death trap due to its gasoline engine burning its crew alive. It was also rumored that the British started calling the Ronson. Lights the first time, every time. However, no documentation exists proving this. In fact, this is a misconception that the M4 was a death trap due to its gasoline engine. It's simply not true. The issue was when an enemy round struck the ammunition rack, there would be a catastrophic flash fire, followed by explosion. This was very common in the early tanks, even in Panzer IVs were just as bad for igniting and exploding. It is estimated that the M4s and the Panzer IVs had the same amount of catastrophic failures. The United States tried fixing this with a couple solutions. The first was quick and easy. They just added some applique plates in front of the ammo racks. Later in mid-1944, a wet stowage was installed in the tanks to prevent explosions. A wet stowage was a mixture of water and ethylene glycol inside the fill jacket. If struck, the logic was the liquid would spill out, extinguishing the fire. It is estimated that the wet stowage provided a decrease in catastrophic rate by an impressive 75%. On top of that, the United States found on average they lost 0.6 of a crew member per knocked out tank. The survivability rate is higher than any other tank on the battlefield. The idea that the M4 was a death trap is simply wrong. Myth: a weak armor? Another issue plaguing the Sherman. It was said that it had paper-thin armor, and anything could go through it. However, in the early wars in 1942, the Sherman only faced the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IV. The Panzer III had a 37mm cannon, whilst the Panzer IV had a low velocity 75mm. The Panzer III could only penetrate 47mm and a low velocity of 45mm at 500 meters. These rounds just bounced off the Sherman. In truth, the Sherman's armor in the early war was far superior than the Panzer III's and Panzer IV's. However, as the war progressed, the German answered back with the Panzer IV Aus F2, which had upgraded armor and had a new gun, the high velocity 75mm, which could finally knock out the Sherman. In truth, the Sherman and the T-34 share very similar characteristics. The T-34 is often applauded for its revolutionary angled armor. However, the Sherman also had angle armor. The T-34 had a 45mm glacis angled at 60 degrees, which gave it an effective thickness of 70mm. The M4 in 1942 had a 50mm glacis angled at 55 degrees, which gave an effective thickness of 89mm. As the war progressed, the T-34-85 was introduced, which upgraded its turret armor, however, it kept the same hull. Whilst the Sherman upgraded its armor at a 63mm and reduced its angle to 47 degrees, which gave an effective thickness of 92mm. The Sherman did have some weaknesses. The M4 had a weakened area on the cheek of its turret to accommodate for the electric turret drive. This weakness was found and a piece of metal was welded to compensate for the lack of armor. Also, due to the extreme angle of the front glacis, the driver and bow gunner edge had to stick out. Due to this, it gave a weakness around those areas. To compensate, a steel plate was welded in front of those to increase its armor. And perhaps, the worst design of all, the lack of a loader's hatch. In case of emergency, the loader will be the last to exit the tank. As the M4A2 came along, it fixed all of these issues. The electric turret drive was fixed. They reduced the angle of the front glacis from 55 to 47, giving room for proper hatches. And a loader's hatch was finally installed. So, did the Sherman have poor armor? This myth is completely false. Comparing it to the Tiger or the Panther won't do it justice, as the Tiger was designed as a heavy tank and the Panther, although classified as a medium tank, weighs just as much as a heavy tank. The M4 was not better than Panther and Tiger. However, so few Tigers and Panthers were made, giving it the encounter rate very low. It is said the United States only encountered the Tigers 3 times during the war. For a medium tank, the Sherman outclassed its fellow Panzer IVs and Stugs, which were the backbone of the German army, and the most encountered on the field. Myth: a weak gun? Another issue plaguing the Sherman was its gun was too weak to destroy enemy tanks. In the early war, the 75mm was more than adequate to penetrate enemy's armor. The M61 could penetrate 90mm of armor at 500 meters. In 1942, the German panzers had armor up to 70mm, which proved no issues for the 75mm to penetrate. However, as the war progressed, the Germans began having thicker armor. As a result, the 75mm did struggle in late war. The United States were made aware of the Tiger I's appearance, and knew a better gun was needed, and they started designing the 76mm in August 1942. It was not until August 1944 that the United States would implement a 76mm cannon on the M4 Sherman, such as the M4A1, A2, and A3s. The 76mm had improved penetration up to 130mm at 500 meters, which could easily incapacitate a Tiger. The 76mm could knock out a Tiger at 1500 meters, and a Panther at 1000 meters. However, the German gun usually outranged the M4s, as the Tiger could kill the Sherman between 1500 to 2000 meters, and the Panther could knock out Sherman at 2000 meters, twice the range of the M4 76 high velocity. Although the 76mm was an improvement, it was still not good enough. The 76 had a velocity of 792 meters per second and could penetrate 130mm at 500 meters, whilst the 88mm had a velocity of 770 meters per second but could penetrate 150 millimeters. This showed that the 76 and 88mm had remarkably similar properties. However, the 88 was still superior. So, did the Sherman have a weak gun? This is partially true. The German had superior armament than the Shermans. However, in the late war, German armor was a rare sight, and the Allies mostly dealt with PaKs and their rocket launchers such as the Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust, which the 75mm was more suited to deal with those. It is unfortunate that the 76mm could not live up to what the United States wanted it to be. It is unfortunate the M4 gained such a bad reputation after the war. The Sherman was a well-designed tank and highly successful throughout. The Sherman was well received and loved by its crew. Even though its gun and armor couldn't keep up with the Panthers and Tigers, it performed its duty for infantry support very well. The M4 Sherman, from a strong start in the deserts of Northern Africa, and an even stronger finish in Germany, the M4 Sherman never ceased to dominate the battlefield. A determined tank that just kept on pushing. A tank that couldn't take no for an answer. Unwavering against its worthy adversary. Thank you so much for watching.